So it's been a while. The OODA loopers have been away refining their decision-making abilities and otherwise doing work and ranting online, Nigel. And so we're back for, I think it's the fifth, is it the fifth session? I don't know. The fifth session. And as a bit of homework, I gave everybody a reading assignment, or at least asked them to casually take a look at a paper on something called M-OODA. Does anybody remember what M stands for? I don't know if it, did they ever say anything? Because there's M-OODA and anyway.
Modified OODA loop, I think.
Modified. I don't know, Ben, because the military folks here will, and the officers will probably have understood a lot of the paper better than me. I had to actually go and Google what C2 and C3 meant. I had no idea what's all this C2 stuff. And so Google C2 military, and it just means command and control. And then they do C3 command, control, and communication. And then in our previous notes, and I'm just looking at my screen because there's too many for me to remember, Kim had sort of talked about, we'd done a lot, this session had covered a lot of teaming scenarios where fast OODA loops and team resonance would be beneficial in the clear, complicated, and chaotic domains. And the complex domain may require us to slow down the OODA loops. And we had a lot of the timey-wimey stuff in previous sessions we talked about. Especially if they're ones used in other domains, and we would need to switch to an explore style of OODA loop, which may be done rapidly. So modified OODA loop in some way. And of course, Lou had talked about how to get faster OODA loops and faster decision making. And certainly when we're in a team or a hostile situation, we need to be able to think rapidly, and the team needs to be able to work together. And Kim went on to say there's value in exploring examples of harmonized teams responding to events and working through where they would be responding to chaotic events. So a lot of things that Lou and Ron would be familiar with. And of course, even the guys from the military would be familiar with that from their days in the military. And where they would be working in a complex domain. What are the differences and where are the transition points? And overall, the transitions between domains are interesting, worth exploring a bit more. So this is, again, getting back to that original conversation of mapping Cynefin and the OODA loop more closely together, understanding how things change in different domains of complexity, and even in that aporia and confusion maybe in the middle. So the M-OODA paper I sent out really was trying to modify the OODA loop to work, and I'm looking at it on the screen, and I'll share some things on the screen in a minute briefly, to work in a multi-team or a multi-tiered decision-making environment. And one of the things I'll set up here, because my reading of the paper, if I'm reading the way, well, my interpretation of my reading of the paper is it actually doesn't create a modified OODA loop or a multi-team OODA loop. What it creates is a hierarchical decision-making structure where the people who are the troops, they in their case, soldiers or people on the ground, are actually the equivalent of business analysts going out there and gathering all the data points, doing all the sense making and shoving it up the hierarchy for the higher ups to make a decision, and then send it back down for them to go execute. And hopefully the time it takes for all that to occur doesn't negate the benefit of faster decision making. So there's a few things I've thrown out. I'm just going to open the floor and see if anybody wants to pick up some of these themes, some of these ideas, and run with some of this conversation.
Just a quick thought. MOODA could be modular as well, because I seem to remember the paper was talking about it being a kind of modular approach, where I think you've got the, what was it, process, state, and control or something like that.
Yeah.
So I think
for the benefit of everybody else, I'll just share the picture I have on my screen. And then that should, at least, that's the modified OODA loop, or the modular OODA loop that we're all discussing, just for the benefit of the tape. So everybody, when they watch this back later, will have a clue of what we're talking about. And they changed the nomenclature a bit, the observe, orient, decide, act. They sort of turn it into select, act, sense, understand. And there is a table that better defines that. In fact, just again, for the benefit of everybody playing with this, I actually put that table out just to, here we go. Let me see if I can put this up just, and to give an idea of what they were trying to do with this. But again, I don't think it achieves their aim. So this is a Word doc, but basically data gathering, situational understanding, action selection, and action implementation. But their model of this, unfortunately, had the data gathering and understanding at the lower levels, and then people completely abstracted from the problem, doing action selection and synthesis, I assume, and then sending it back down to the poor squaddies to do action implementation. So that was a little bit of what that was covering. But yeah, you might be right, Chris. It might be modular. I'll try and scan it as you guys are talking.
And they changed it the next year. They presented another paper and changed the name to C-OODA the next year, and built off of this model to take it even further down the hierarchical path. But you hit the nail right on the head with your analysis and my analysis, and that's exactly what everybody was trying to do at the time, Nigel, was build these massive sensor technology based, because you had C4, ISR, they were, I mean, command and control went all over the place back in the early 2000s, but it was all really focused on gathering as much data, either human intelligence data or remote sensing data, stuffing it back up to the decision maker, one decision maker, you know, and supporting a top-down hierarchical model rather than a bottom-up. And in that C2 paper, they flat talk about the OODA loop being a bottom-up tool, like Ponch, you know, has talked about, and dismissed it outright because of that fact alone, that they needed a top-down model.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to hear what you guys think, because you're operational, of course, and I know Ben, at least, I know Ben's background has been in the military, because I'm not really sure what they were trying to achieve here, other than they were trying to achieve better decision making at scale. But as I say, what we seem to see in this, and I keep waving at the screen, nobody can see, which is not very helpful. But I'll, in fact, let me just bring this up, because I just, for, again, the benefit of people who'll be watching this, if I can find the right screen I'm actually sharing, there we go. So basically, and I'll just collapse this down a little bit, just so people can see that. But there you've got it. You've got this, you know, people at the bottom shoving it up to the top where decisions are being made. And they talk about commander's intent, and in the flow system, I talk about leader's intent. It's just our porting of commander's intent. But eventually, when you read through this, it really is just still commanders giving instructions to the people. And it's the antithesis of some of the things I talk about, distributed leadership, which is decentralizing and distributing the decision making to the people at the lower ranks, because, hey, they're going through their individual OODA loops, they're doing all the sense making, they're doing all the data gathering, they're understanding what needs to happen, and they're making the decisions, and then they're acting upon those decisions, where this is now dragging the decisions away from them and giving them arbitrary actions to execute on, which to me doesn't sound like the thing somebody under fire really wants, whether it's a police officer in a chaotic situation or a soldier in a battle situation, really wants to be faffing around sending things up the chain. And I thought that McChrystal had solved some of this with Team of Teams and some of the things he talked about. So I'm going to stop talking, but there's a bit of the background and my thoughts on that. I don't know what everybody else's ideas and thoughts are.
So I did my homework about 5 minutes before I joined the call, but there is a certain amount of resonance in some of the things I've been thinking about. So what I do like about this paper is I like the state, the kind of hidden state in the middle of these different modules. I think that's a valuable addition, because it gives you a level of sort of internal representation that doesn't have to be directly visible. So that's the represented world, internal world, decision, set of actions. Those are all the states. I think I do agree that, this, I don't know when this paper came out, but it seems to be a product of the time, of this kind of desire for linear thinking and desire to turn everything into a machine. So that's a bit problematic. And the other thing is that, these things are all, these states are all present at every different level, I think, right? They're distributed. So, you will have a representation of what you're seeing in the command tent, as well as you would have a representation of what you were seeing if you were one of the troops on the ground actually in contact with the situation. So I think the separation of modules and the different levels is far too arbitrary. It's this desire to turn things into a machine that you can model in code. Now I have that desire as well, but I'm not quite as naive as to think that you can do that, especially not in this simplistic a fashion.
It was 2004 the paper was published, by the way, just for people's reference. We're in 21 now, so you can sort of put 16, 17 years ago. Thinking maybe has changed. I'm not sure when the OODA paper came out. That was going to be homework for another session. 2005, so it was just a year later.
But it's interesting that this came out nearly a decade after Boyd passed on, and that and we're still 25 years after Boyd passed on, still having conversations about it's not a linear thing. And I think when you go back to the original stuff that Boyd talked about, he understood that really well. So it's almost like we're unpicking a whole bunch of misunderstandings, is a bit unkind, but a whole bunch of people that wanted to make it a lot more simple than it is, whereas I think they lose some of the elegance when they try and go for simplicity, perhaps.
You mean like creating a 2x2 matrix to explain chaos? I'm sorry, that's a tangent I'm not going to go down, but I feel you know exactly what I'm talking about there.
I mean, perhaps we're more aware of biases and the biases that so many systems now. Back in the old days, of course, we came up with new systems as ways to do things, and I think now there are so many systems in so many areas of business and the military and pretty much every industry has its own systems. We're starting to realize the values of systems that actually do something within the context we want, and systems that are just, you've kind of got your Hawthorne effect stuff where people are reacting to novelty rather than actually reacting to something that's tried and tested. And maybe it's to do with the biases. Maybe it feels like it's almost OODA for ordered domains because it was an attempt to force what was complex into order, so it was just easier to deal with, because that's what we as Ben said, it's something that we all like to do on occasion. Sometimes when things feel very out of our control, we feel like we can just pull them in.
So linear OODA in ordered domains of complexity.
In ordered domains.
Andrew,
I wouldn't have added the complexity. That's another domain.
ordered domains of complexity thinking is what I was thinking about.
Yeah.
Andrew.
I'm being pedantic.
I am really interested in this stuff. So it almost appears that there is a magnetism towards things like this. So regardless of what people learn and regardless of how far the thinking in the space of complexity goes, there always seems to be a magnetism towards linear thinking that you're fighting against. The idea that there is one right way, that there's no polarity, that there's no tension between two possible outcomes that might both have goodness and badness. And you kind of see that in politics, you see it in organizations, you see it in policy development. Like it just, people keep getting drawn back to that idea that things can be certain and can be predictable if only I have enough information.
You know, that is a really interesting thought. And some of my recent rantings online and or debates, discussions, postulations, whatever you want to call them, have been around the fact that everybody is trying to simplify and make simple things that shouldn't be made simple or cannot be made simple. And I've even seen that in the discussions in the flow world out there. I mean, they're talking about the flow manifesto now, and I'm on the periphery of that, but I'm having a meeting with people who have been described, coming up with this, and I'm not involved with it at all. But I'm getting sort of involved to see what it's all about, but they're trying to create a flow playbook, a flow methodology, a flow way to do, and they're losing the whole. They're trying to agilize it, or whatever the word is, or McDonaldize it. I learned that word yesterday. It's a phrase I'd not heard before. Some clever person said, which is basically turning it into a Big Mac, into a commodity that a fast food sort of production of an approach. And some of my sort of wrangling with some of the other commentators on social media has been a little bit around that, is that they're just trying to dumb everything down as if we're all idiots or we're all incapable of thought, or just as a way to sell a magic bean, a solution, a framework or something to the next check wielding CFO so that we can actually go do something. But what it's just like the conversations about lean thinking. I mean, Toyota's been doing this for 80 years. Yet we're still struggling to get, good operational excellence going and good continuous improvement and that type of thing. And I'm starting to wonder if we're our own worst enemy, in the fact that we're not willing to go the extra yard to learn, to understand, to comprehend. I mean, some of us are, clearly we have an audience for the material that we've been producing, but the general approach is find the easiest path, the path of least resistance, and implement it, irrespective of whether it's going to work. The big 4 or 5 consulting houses roll out the new nonsense every 4 or 5 years. They go and sort of boilerplate it into all these organizations who spend literally tens of millions of dollars a year implementing this thing that doesn't work. You become really good at doing a methodology, but don't solve anything. And John Turner, Professor Turner, was saying the other day in a conversation, is that the amount of energy, the reason templates don't work is the amount of energy exerted to implement a template tends to be greater than the benefit you get from having the templates implemented. So you put all this energy into doing the thing right, and then you actually don't get an equal return on that investment out the other side. And then they blame the company, they blame the practitioners, they blame the contractors or the coaches or consultants, or they blame the tool or the methodology, and they go buy the next one that somebody's selling. And that's what I've seen in a lot of the OODA representations. If you just Google images, you find a whole raft of horribleness out there. I mean, truly horribleness, horrific stuff, it'll be banned. And then, as I say, in everything else. So I don't know, I think, Andrew, you're onto something clearly there, but I don't know how we address that. I don't know how we redress that. Kim?
That comes back to where I said we can get these harmonized teams having practiced and made decisions ahead of time to be able to respond to a chaotic, unexpected event where there are predictable outcomes from doing actions, right? And you can put small activities together that work nicely. So that's where your adaptation comes in. What I wanted to understand, because I think this is important from a business perspective, it's easy to talk about, and it's easy for us to imagine people responding to emergency events or military events. But in a business perspective, things tend to go at a slightly slower pace than that. You can't see that there's someone impacted and you have to go and help them. It takes time to sense that you've moved from a chaotic event into a complex domain. And I wanted to talk about what are the signals for that. So one of the signals might be you do an action that when you're normally responding to a chaotic event, so you repeat the same thing, you get the same outcome, right? When you move into a complex domain, you would be doing the same thing, but getting a different outcome. So you'd have to be looking for, I've done the same thing, step 1, 2, 3. You'd have to be looking for, am I getting the same result? And then you would realize that you're starting to transition into the complex domain. So I think this is the thing. How does it happen? There might be some things from the people that do work in an operational environment. When would you know that this transition might have happened? And can we then extrapolate those things that you observe, that pattern that you observe, into the business domain so that we can utilize that thinking and how to sense and look for that pattern as well?
Kim, I think that's absolutely brilliant. And I mean, because what you're talking about, I'm sorry, Ron, I cut you off, but I'll come to you in a second, is that we're going across that liminal boundary. If people are familiar with the Cynefin diagram, there's this liminal boundary. So we're crossing that liminal boundary, and there's that transitional layer between chaos and complexity, or vice versa, of course. There's nothing saying we can't go the other way. But what you're talking about, which will make a lot of people in the patterns world cheer with delight, is how do we detect some patterns which help us understand where we are and where we're transitioning to, and where we're reaching the limitations, that bounded applicability of our tools, methods, approaches, etc., and techniques. Ron?
Amazon does this really well with, throwing multiple small teams at the same problem over different geographic regions, and then looking at the results and trying to suss out which one's working better, what pieces are working better. So they've got that many experiments kind of approach going, and it lets them, start to see what not so much say from the top down, oh, this is going to work and here's what we're going to do, but let it kind of boil up from that small team level to what's going to succeed and what isn't. And they kind of use that same approach with business development. If somebody's got a good idea, they're going to give it a try. They'll throw a couple of teams at it, take a look at it, see how it goes, and if it fails, it fails. If it works, it works. And they've been magnificently successful at scaling and growing based on that kind of a approach. But it's clearly a complex domain kind of approach, and very much a bottom-up small team. Precisely what you're talking about. You hit it right on the head, Kim, with where you were going with that. Very, very neat model.
Yeah. So I think there's a bit of an elephant in the room to address here, is that in the business domain, or many places that I've worked as a technologist, the basics for even beginning to address what Kim was talking about there is not in place, which is actually looking at the results. Like, in far too many places I've worked, there's this kind of one-way linear flow of, right, here's a bunch of stories, they're in a pipe, you pull them off the pipe to implement the stories, and then you ship it, right? And as a developer, or as somebody in a development team, you never hear about that thing again. It's gone, right? And then you pull the next thing off. So, part of what you would have to have in place in order to be even able to start having these conversations is a feedback loop at all, right? Regardless of whether it's an OODA loop or a good feedback loop or any kind of thing, right? Having the bloody thing in the first place is step one that probably, I don't know, a large percentage, I wouldn't want to estimate, but a large percentage of companies or teams within companies do not even have.
Can I bring us back to Kim's question, though, because I was fascinated by that as well. In the, outside of the corporate space, so you're in an operational situation in policing or in the military, and you are in chaos. What are some of the signs that you start to see that you might be moving out of chaos and into complexity?
Luke?
So I know you guys keep on saying I'm operational, right? And I think what you're getting at is that I still wear a gun and handcuffs and put on a vest every now and then and go out. But the bulk of my work is spent with data and intelligence analysis. The tempo is much slower than gunfights and car chases. My team spends weeks, months analyzing things that have been going on for 5 years, right? Certain crime patterns And what we talk about with patterns is there's variables, there's clues, and there's clusters that keep linking up and repeating themselves over and over again. So what happened so my team's been following a particular crime pattern since the spring of 2016. We're 5 years into this, and we had no idea what was going on. It was something that we had never experienced in the metropolitan area, and very few metropolitan areas in the United States are experiencing this. So we're seeing this for the very first time, and it's auto theft and carjackings. They were happening at pace in ways. Cars were ending up in geographic areas in certain neighborhoods that we had not experienced before. But once we started collecting data, which is where I resonated with the MOODA, is in this data gathering phase, or the data gathering module. Once we started collecting that, we started seeing certain variables continually pop up in those incidents. It was in the modus operandi, or the way that the crimes were occurring. It was in the places the crimes occurred, the times they occurred, the people that were committing them, the neighborhoods that stolen cars were being recovered in, the types of add-on crimes that those stolen cars were committing. And we started establishing certain patterns, and we started attributing certain crimes to certain criminal street gangs. But now what we've seen within the last 6 months or so is crossovers between those gangs. Certain players are locked up, they're not in the wild committing crimes anymore, and they've started to combine. And now we're seeing clues that do not match up well. They do not match the pattern anymore. And we're forced into looking at what new patterns are existing. It's a continual cycle of gathering all this data and trying to orient ourselves to it. And these are done at timescales of weeks and months, which are considerably different than I think what most folks look at as operational policing, which is seconds and minutes. So my work in intelligence is much slower and probably more consistent with maybe more corporate data gathering and developing models than maybe some of, boots on the ground police.
Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I've just been listening to, everything that's kind of being said, and there are just a few things that are connecting up here. So I think that there are a few bits that, like, one of the things I'm feeling is like intermediation. I feel intermediation, certainly within structures, is probably redirecting or interrupting loops that would otherwise be quite perhaps valid or viable in terms of decision making, strategically at least. How do you interrupt somebody else's loops when you can see that they're failing and they're not going to be adding to what you're trying to do? But can you identify their loops in the first place? Like, I don't know if it's just a case of your loops versus theirs. Do you have to match up the loops that you have versus their loops for the correct kind of interruption or triumph or whatever you want to see there? But then kind of going to what Kim was saying and what Lou was just saying, really there you're starting to talk about like the abductive reasoning side, right? You're looking at the what Dave calls the logic of of hunches, and I don't know where the origin of that is, but the idea that it's not a case of connecting the dots, it's a case of there's too many dots to connect a lot of the time, so you just have to allow those patterns to emerge over time, and then you feel like some of them are connected. And this is something that I do quite well in some arenas because of my neurology. I see patterns really easily and I see linkages between them, but I have no clue why they're there. And I spend most of my time trying to justify what the linkage is between things, and it doesn't always work out. But that's actually how I write a lot of my books, like my fantasy stuff. I write random scenes and I think, well, how should this go? Because it doesn't feel like flow or connection. And then I move stuff around and I suddenly realize that there's a coherent path through all of this. And it's often quite an epiphany, right? And so that's kind of the logic of hunches thing. I think that, I mean, does this sound like it's fitting in?
Yeah, I was writing things down as Lou was talking, and I was reading what Andrew was writing in the chat as well. And I'll pull some of you into this because I think that what I'm hearing from Lou is that they spend a lot of time on data gathering, analysis, and synthesis, and making sense of it, sense making, if you want. Well, I think a lot of businesses, a lot of corporations gather a lot of data, don't do great analysis and fall down miserably on synthesis, and then just ignore what it tells them because it doesn't align with their predefined mental model or something, or their group think. Yeah. And so I think that yeah, Andrew.
I think the really interesting difference between what Lou's talking about and what we see in organizations is that in organizations, we gather information from operations in order to inform central decisions. Whereas it sounds like what Lou's doing is gathering information, intel, and patterns, feeding that information down to inform operational decisions, which is a big difference, right? It's a switch between thinking about, all right, I have all this information, now I'm going to make a decision about what we're going to do next strategically, and the teams are going to implement that decision. From there to, I am going to gather analytics and data and patterns and things. I'm going to feed that information through the organization to the people that are making decisions about what we do next.
That's the key thing.
I think that's fundamental.
Sorry, Ron, go ahead.
That's fundamentally, I think, that difference in thinking of the top-down one decision maker versus the team, and how you apply what Ben was saying, about technology and building the support systems. Who is the system designed to support? With the M-OODA, it's designed to support the top-down thinker. With a lot of other systems, you see them designed to support the bottom-up, the team, like Andrew was talking about, and it pushes, not makes it a pull, but a push to the team level, so that they have this shared understanding of what's occurring in the environment, of what they're dealing with and facing, so that they can make good decisions as a team. Certainly based on the commander's intent and what they're trying to accomplish, the big picture mission. But they can take all that data and make their little piece of it work that much better.
So that's interesting, because what I was about to say for it when I interrupted you was the key there for distributed leadership is allowing the people lower down to make those decisions. And I don't about in a hierarchical sense. I don't mean that less people, they're just the fact that they're not ranked as senior. Lou, from your perspective, when you've got all this data coming in from the rank and file, and it's been gathered in various different ways and analyzed and synthesized, and the patterns are appearing, and you're getting what you think is some understanding, some making sense of this, do you then pass that down as Ron was describing, so that the boots on the ground or the people dealing with the front line can actually make better decisions? Or are you still making the decisions at a more senior level and then them implementing them?
I think there's different types of decisions. So to go back to MOODA in this, and let me pull it up so I'm using the right terminology that they used. So they have this data gathering module, which is like, we have sensors too, right? We have different ways of collecting. Some of them are people, but some of them are just technology systems that auto-generate and can extract certain bits of data. And then there's a situation understanding, which is, how do I understand this? Thanks. That's yeah, table 3 is exactly what I'm reading off of. So the understanding of it, some of that is also done automatically by telling a computer, make sense of this. What day of the week are these crimes happening? What time frames during the evenings or mornings are these happening? Those are things that can be done automatically. But the most valuable people to me are those that can put the human judgment, the intuition, have that Fingerspitzengefühl to it, where they can then write about it or design a table around it, write a story about it to then share. And it becomes distributed sense making at that point. And the intelligence analysts are writing reports, basically digesting all of this information and then pushing something out to help make sense of it. So intelligence teams have to take this in. And then there's a hierarchy of basically what you should be caring about. For example, the chief of police should not necessarily care about the names, the addresses, and the specific crimes. But they should maybe know the neighborhoods and the names of the gangs. Maybe not even that, but then you've got commanders in between that definitely need to know the neighborhoods. Maybe they know the streets, maybe they know with a little bit more granularity. And then there's the detectives and the officers that are in the field. They know the names, the girlfriends, the grandmas, the street addresses, the apartment numbers, every smallest of details. And we write different intelligence products or reports to be consumed by each of those different layers. The chiefs and the high level decision makers are reading a different report than the folks that are investigating the cases and out in the field. Does that make sense, Nigel?
Oh, no, it makes perfect sense. I mean, no, absolutely. And this is why I'm trying to understand the different reflections. Ben.
So, okay, so I think there's a chance to pull some of this stuff together here. So Andrew, you were talking about this kind of, the reason that simple answers are kind of a bit too sticky, right? And it's almost like, it's an attractor in a landscape, right? It's a thing that is, I mean, it's like the 4-step OODA loop diagram, right? It's a thing that is oversimplified, but because it's simple, it's easy to grab onto, so people keep going back to it. I think there's also a way that we can bring in destruction and creation here. So the stuff that Lou was talking about gathering variables, clues, well, in fact, I think it was Chris who said variables, clues, and clusters, right? You're going from raw data, and then you're applying essentially what Boyd called the destruction part, right? You're taking that raw data, you're turning it into some kind of answer. The problem that I think maybe we're coming to that in the traditional business is that collapsing happens all the way up the company to the one person at the top who makes the decision, or the small group of people at the top who make the decision. Whereas in the context of Lou's work, and I'm reminded of the Northern Ireland tour I did, where I did a bit of work in the intelligence cell. That is not centralized in one place. The aggregations are spread out all over the place, right? So you aggregate something, and then it's almost like a broadcast. So anybody within that organization can subscribe to any part of that broadcast that they find interesting. So just because a report is written for a senior officer or a someone a bit further down the hierarchy, doesn't mean that they're the only people that can read it. Anyone can go and read it. So it's almost like we're trying to do too much destruction before we do some more creation in a company, right? We're trying to get to a too perfect an answer or too perfect a decision, whereas what we should be doing is allowing multiple decisions to happen in a distributed fashion, which means that there isn't a single simple truth, right? You could take a snapshot of all the data that Lou gathered over a course of a year. You could aggregate it up to an answer of something, right? You could ask a question, but that's pointless because it's a moving, evolving environment, and people need to take action, be goal directed, and do all the things that Boyd talked about in order to keep that kind of information coming in from the environment. In which case, by the time you've aggregated that all to one answer, it's meaningless. And I think that's probably the mistake that many companies make. They aggregate all the way up to the leadership team, and then, you know, by the time that work has been done, that energy has been expended, it's out of date.
Kim.
So I'm going to bring in an odd example. Last night we happened to watch an early 50s movie called The Mantis. And it's an interesting movie because it talks about the radar network to sense things. And it also highlighted the role that ground observers played, which looked like they were civilians that donated their time and could report stuff. And of course, the mantis is a giant praying mantis that's frozen in, you know, the ice up in the north, and it gets released and comes to life, and it's destroying everything. And the point is, you know, they need the sensor networks of the ground people, because sometimes they can see it on the radar and sometimes it disappears from the radar. And it was interesting. It was really cool because they go, well, the ground people will pick that up for us and they'll report in, so we'll be able to know where the mantis is going to. And the only information the most senior person needed to know is where it's likely to go, so they can deploy the big troop people to the right place, because that's a big decision. You've only got a certain amount of people and equipment. You have to deploy it to the place where the thing is most likely going to be. But on the ground, the people there, once it kind of got into a tunnel, which was between Manhattan and New Jersey, I think that's where it ended up. And, you know, they ended up deciding to fill the tunnel with smoke, and they, you know, covered it with tarpaulin so that, you know, the mantis wouldn't see the people who were going to deploy the gas bombs to them. So there's all sorts of things in there. They'd already tried in the frozen north to kill the mantis with a flamethrower and guns, and that didn't work. So by the time it got to the New York area, they had worked out they needed these gas bombs to kill it, right? So I think there's a whole bunch of things in there where there were predefined decisions that people knew what to do and what to try. Now, that one where they tried to kill it with a flamethrower and a gun, right? That was clearly responding to a chaotic event, but it didn't work. So that moved them up into the complex domain, and they knew they had to try something else to kill it. So that was sort of, that's bringing together, how do we know we've moved? What do we do when we've moved? We tried other things. It's also the broad array of information and intelligence and how it needs to be used in different ways at different levels to be able to make decisions, because you know, you've only got certain equipment that's big, it has to go somewhere. So yeah, I think that movie weirdly brings all of these ideas together in a way that helps me to digest it.
I'm just looking at Chris because you started talking about 50s sort of fantasy, sort of B horror movies about giant things, and that's right in his domain of his day-to-day life, I guess. So
I have to look in the mirror. I mean,
but a lot of what you're saying is actually very interesting, and I was thinking about that liminal transition between chaos and complexity, or vice versa. And I was listening to some of the things Ben was saying prior to you, and thinking, you know, there's lots of conflicting information comes in, and rapidly synthesizing that, making sense of it, often isn't possible. And so therefore, is that a sort of a description? I'm being very careful here. Is that a description or a characteristic of being in chaos? And when you start to recognize and make sense of the data, and make sense of the patterns, and start to synthesize it, and as I say, make sense of it, we don't have all the answers. There's still some unpredictability there, but we're sort of moving across that liminal threshold into complexity. I don't know. I'm just positing this. I'm not saying I've got it right, Chris.
no, I'm just thinking that fits quite well into what we were talking about back when you know, Lou was talking about the training that was done, and I was asking if it was a case of, you know, the kind of newer recruits are getting overloaded with information, and as you're moving across, you know, you're transitioning from domain to domain, maybe part of that transition, or what that transition is the ability to start filtering things.
I don't know. Go ahead, Lou, Ron, I don't know, whoever.
I'll take it. Ron, go ahead.
Okay, so you're absolutely right, and the new students are overloaded largely because their orientation. I mean, it's something completely new to them, so their orientation is not such that they've experienced it before. They can process that information. I mean, our whole goal in our first couple of years of training folks in field training and academy training is to give them better orientation, so they get on the street, they at least have a foundation for where they can start to make those decisions. And that kind of gets to that I made a comment earlier that chaos isn't symmetrical, because you can have those brand new recruits in chaos because they just can't make sense of what they're seeing because they've never seen it before. And the experienced field training officer standing right next to them who's absolutely not in chaos and just, you know, helping the recruit work through things. And it works for both sides, the other side as well. The criminals or the folks out on the street, you know, they may have a really good plan about what they're doing. To what Lou was talking about with their strategy for stealing cars or doing carjackings and where they take them and what they're doing. They're in their minds really well organized, but you know, it's taken Lou's team a little while to get it all figure the patterns out. So again, that asymmetrical chaos that you're dealing with to try to fight back into what's going on.
I think this is all really important because of what I know Kim and I know Andrew as well are trying to do, which is to take a lot of these conversations, the threads of thoughts, the academia, the praxis and everything, and bring this together into some practical, easy to consume, easy to understand advice that can be provided to the people who most of us work for, other than the police officers, the corporate world where we earn our day-to-day crust, and actually help them understand this better. Because you go and draw Cynefin on a whiteboard in front of a C-suite, they all sort of glaze over and start texting each other. Whereas, you know, we need a way to sort of explain to them the things that Kim's raising. And I think we're getting closer to this, and maybe mapping OODA to Cynefin is an outcome we want. We'll bring Dave Snowden into these conversations to tell us we've got it all wrong at some point. But the thing is, if we can improve that, but then have that business language to take it where we can actually use it in a valuable way, so we don't dumb everything down, we don't make everything a linear loop and simplistic. Lou, I think you wanted to add something.
How do you connect multiple truths? So facts, pieces of data, how do you connect them? Now, if you look over my shoulder, because I keep looking at this in my screen, this is Post-it notes on butcher block paper. And each of these Post-it notes started out at one point with me talking to my team saying, I'm seeing something in my head that I want to put down on a visualization. And it started with 4 or 5 Post-it notes with some solid lines of things that I absolutely know connected, others with dotted lines, others with dashed lines, and they all meant a different confidence level that things connected to each other. Now, this might not scale well with Post-it notes when you're dealing with thousands of bits. I mean, these might have what, 50, 60, 75 Post-it notes on there. It's manageable to do it manually. What we're asking of our computers now is to find those connections with varying levels of confidence, with repeatability, with consistency, to find what patterns exist and to how one thing impacts another thing. And it will give us some prediction that that thing will happen again. And we continually feed data into it to find out, did it work the way we wanted it to work? Did the connection happen again? This is history on the board, right? This is stuff that happened already. This has nothing to do with the future. but I use this to help me predict what's going to happen. I predict that the people that have the most lines coming in and out of his or her little box or name is an influential player in the crimescape of Chicago.
You know, that's
so how does this scale well? Because I can't do this with thousands of bits of information, but I want to try to find a computer program, some algorithm that can do it.
so you've just made the case for big data, or what Dave calls is thick data, which is the useful bits of big data. And I mean, one of the comments earlier made me think of Jidoka again, because people are rushing, and I saw this horrible OODA loop depiction, which was all automation and automated decision making and AI and ML and machine learning, artificial intelligence stuff in this loop, and there was no humans in this whole thing at all. And there was one entry point, one exit point. It was horrible. But this is where I start to think, because we need the fast computation and scalability of the digital capabilities that we know exist. And we do have the programming capability to take some of the techniques we've developed over the last few years and actually do some analysis and synthesis of the data based upon how we teach the machine and then how it learns from some of the patterns it's seeing, that pattern detection. But then we still need the humans at some point in that chain to interpret that, because otherwise the machine starts saying, or you know, certain demographics and characteristics of people are just the criminals and everybody else is innocent. We know this is nonsense. And so we still, I'm just, you know, it's the sort of stuff we're seeing with TSA in the States and things, you know. And so we need to, this is where the whole thing of removing humans and giving it to the machines is a terrifying concept. But this is something that I think is absolutely essential that we need to get a grip on, because then that technology is, because I always talk about digital as being an enabler. I get really frustrated with all this nonsense about digital transformation. And I know it's some people's business, so you have to use that terminology because that's what the client's buying. But what I'm seeing is digital is an enabler that's actually removing some of the inhibiting constraints that Lou is describing, and using lots of post-it notes on a wall, not being scalable beyond a certain reasonable level. Ron, you were nodding furiously at some of the things I was saying.
Well, I spent the better part of 2 decades doing exactly what Lou's talking about, building these data systems, connecting the data systems, data warehouses, using Bayesian and machine learning, neural networks, the whole 9 yards to suss out those patterns. But the key that we always went back to was that we had to put a person's eyes, at least one, and hopefully multiple people's eyes on the results to get that gut check of whether they were really valid and do the right interpretation. And I think, you know, I talked to my daughter who's managing a security team at Microsoft, and that dealing with AI and dealing with, you know, the big data stuff. And a lot of the problems is that you hit it on the head. We were handing this off to the machine and not looking at the data, and not having that orientation piece where the human is taking their experience and their training and all of the good stuff that you have in that orientation side of things, and applying it to whether or not this is really the result that we want to see, that gut check about, does this make sense or not? And you're dead on with it. We've got to keep that piece in there, or we're going to fail miserably using big data.
And I'm just looking at some of the chat that's scrolling by where Chris is just screaming out weak signal detection, and Luke's saying we're not even seeing the strong signals, which is terrifying when you think about it, you know, because we got all this technology, got all these damn projects going on globally, billions of dollars being spent on tech, and yet we're failing to see the weak signals, the things that are really, really important. And if we're failing to see the strong signals, then we're sort of, I don't know whether it's heuristics or biases or just, you know, inattentional blindness or any of these things we often talk about, but something isn't giving us what we need. So I'm just looking at the time, but thoughts and ideas on this? Kim?
I wanted to come back to Ron's point about Amazon doing experiments well. So my question would be, as a business, how do they make the decision? We need to do experiments on these types of things in these types of areas, compared to, we know this works and we always do this and we always get this same result, so we don't have to experiment there, because everyone, you know, loves the idea of let's experiment. But just as trying to do a 100-page, you know, or 700-page business case in a complex domain is a waste of effort, the same thing, you know, trying to do experiments in the ordered domains can also be a big waste of effort. So that's my question, is how do they make that decision in the business that something is sitting in the complex domain and does require an exploratory approach?
You know, I think they approach it that everything's in the complex domain in the business world, because you're dealing with people, and they you know, allow their teams to kind of suggest what might be, or the people to suggest what might be a good business. You know, it's, you know, the guys sitting around at the water cooler, sitting around having a beer after work and saying, hey, this might work. This might be a good idea. They bring it back to the team, and they're willing to not, you know, sit down and write a formal business case. No, they're willing to let people start to play with it and see where it goes. And, you know, at some juncture, you know, they've got to justify the expense and all that, but they're very, very loose and informal and bottom up in where those decisions at least originate, in how they approach things.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think,
sorry, Ben, go ahead.
yeah, so I had the privilege of watching some of the Amazon professional services folks work when I was doing COVID-19 stuff, and that, I mean, I would just characterize it as gameplay at a completely different level that certainly anyone within the NHS was capable of. And I think, Kim, that might sort of give a bit of a clue about how you apply this in the ordered domain. I think that how you apply this in the ordered domain is that you get so comfortable with operating in the chaos or the chaotic or the complex domain that you just push everyone else in there, because you know that they're going to swim and they're going to sink and you're going to swim. Like that's the competitive advantage of having a good OODA loop, right? It's, well, bring it on, bring the chaos on, because we don't care how chaotic it gets, because we're good at it.
You know, you could say that about Tesla and Elon and the stuff they do, is that they just go
Totally.
and they got pots of cash. I mean, that's the thing with Bezos and Musk. They've got pots and pots of cash. They're not short of a few coins. And so they can throw a ton of money at an idea. And if it goes wrong, they don't really feel it, which a lot of organizations don't have that. And there's a great deal of fear about crashing the organization, you know, trying to keep up or trying to be so innovative as some of these organizations. But indeed, they do just throw things out there. Chris?
Yeah, I was just saying on the back of that, I think one of the advantages that they have is that they know very well what most people are trying to do a lot of the time is to orient themselves, you know, kind of mentally via a map and say, I am here. And they know the value of just saying, we don't care where we are, we're picking a direction and we'll modify it as we go. And I think that that's a really interesting way to kind of, you know, move, because that's where you get the emergence from, really.
Yeah, I mean, I was, you know, I go back to the articles and people will get bored with them, but, you know, the two pizza team articles that were written in various different snooze papers and things, you know, and, you know, that was a purposeful slip. But Bezos used to say that by having these small teams of like 8 people and they're all pretty independent and autonomous, I mean, they're not, you know, it's not holocracy gone mad. It's not the sort of Zappos experiment, but it's the point is that you can drop an idea in without all the hierarchy, bureaucracy, and all the sort of, you know, constraints of a giant organization. I mean, I've been talking to an organization recently. I get somebody who reports directly into the CEO, asks me to go and help. And then I start doing all the things with them. Suddenly procurement and vendor management get involved and create chaos and adding complexity. And the whole thing will probably just spiral down a spout, and sort of goodness knows what will happen in good time. But that's the type of thing that Bezos is stated in some of these newspaper articles that he's trying to avoid, that he's got this organization that can run with an idea and try it out. But again, that type of flexibility comes up with some cost, and there has to be some constraints, stop the lunatics running the asylum. But it seems that a lot of organizations, and even the big famous ones I've been involved in the last few years, not just the big car maker, but one or two others, can't allow that to happen. They need that deep consensus and that sort of deep sort of control at the top, and that whole structure. And I don't know whether we'll ever break that. My apathy levels are exceeding my tolerance levels currently, you know, with some of these organizations. I'm like, what's the point? You know, it's not that we're wrong, and it's not that they know we're right, but they're not willing to actually change. And I just don't know how we're going to break that. I mean, this is, you know, a conversation about faster decision making or how we improve decision making, not necessarily faster decision, better decision making, and how we make better decisions when we're challenged with different aspects of complexity, whether in a very simple, ordered, clear world, or whether we've got an area full of experts, and then we're in this sort of chaotic, complex sort of world, or even worse, sort of swimming around the middle in sort of abject misery and confusion. But Andrew.
Yeah, I think sometimes we do get a little bit disheartened by the length of time it takes to change things. So Agile, the frameworks that led to the Agile Manifesto were around before 2001, 15, 20 years before then. Agile first appeared in software teams sort of around that time. It didn't start to appear in leadership circles until sort of 2005, 2010. It didn't start to appear in executive circles until about 2015, and it's sort of coming onto the mainstream now. And it most certainly hasn't started to appear in board circles in any meaningful way yet. And that's because at each of the different layers in the system that we work in, the lead time for change is longer, because they like a board might get together 12 times a year very briefly. They don't spend a lot of time on looking at new ideas. They're looking at trying to draw out information to be effective at governing a system. So new ideas in governance are going to take a long time to flow through to the board. So all of this stuff, it'll shift. We just have to be a little bit of patience. We need the people doing delivery now to move up to leadership roles. We need the leadership people to move up to executive roles. We need the executive people to move into board roles. And then the cycle is complete. And something that was an early seed of an idea in the 90s is suddenly permeated right through the business landscape by maybe 2030.
Could we accelerate that with some sort of euthanasia at the executive level? I don't know. Maybe if we're in some progressive European country, but no, I mean, that sort of tells me, and I had a great conversation with the CTO at the weekend who said these executives don't have the time to discern, to learn, to digest, to make sense of the things that we're all talking about. They just need somebody to present them with a how-to, a prescription, a roadmap, a playbook, something they can purchase and head into the next sort of 3 to 5 year of transformational stuff. And I'm wondering whether or not we've got to find a way, because these are the people who can actually change the way the organization functions as a complex adaptive system. They can enable, sense making. They can enable things like narratives and storytelling and these sort of tools to make sense of what's happening. They can enable sort of, focus on building effective teams rather than just people who can do methodologies very well. And they can start to create distributed decision making within the organization within enabling constraints. We're not sort of talking, as I say, holacracy here. And one of the talks I'll be giving in Italy later this year is about what Kotter used to call the dual operating system, which people have sort of besmirched a bit, but it's this sort of age of the dual enterprise where we need more freedom in the ranks and less top-down control, but we still need some steering and clever stuff to stop the lunatics running the asylum, as we often use the phrase. But I wonder, Andrew, that we'll all be old and retired and drinking excessively on a beach somewhere beautiful before this ever happens.
That's all right. You were part of the movement, Nigel. You made it happen. But you might not bear the fruits of that movement necessarily, but it's moving in that direction.
So I'll be like most famous artists and musicians. I'll die broke, but famous. It's temper. We've been on this about 70 minutes. Any last thoughts, Lou?
I think this comes down to being okay with not knowing.
Yep.
And being willing to make decisions anyways. And whether it's Colin Powell's 40 to 70%, which I'm not that huge of a fan of, but it comes down to the concept of being okay with not knowing. Understanding that no matter how many Post-it notes I put on here, we're wrong. How many pieces of the puzzle do I need until I can figure out basically what it looks like so I can do something about it? And sure, I might have people in the background trying to put more pieces of the puzzle in there, but if I wait for them, it's simply too late. How do we develop our people to make decisions knowing that you don't know? And that what you're going to be trying, you don't know if it's going to work. And if something does work, if you had multiple teams working on it, you don't necessarily know which of those teams fixed it or made it better or moved you in the right direction. We just have to have an appetite for being okay with knowing enough, understanding that the map is going to be wrong when compared to the territory, and we have to move on regardless. No matter how much data we have, it's just never going to be enough. The story is never going to match up with reality, but we have to say it suffices in the moment.
Ben, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, so I was just thinking of one of my areas of interest is building distributed systems in software. And one of the first things that you have to let go of in distributed systems is consistency, right? You have to deeply understand that there is no single objective truth about the system that you're building or the state that the system is in, because that state is held in multiple different places and it's intractable to be able to transmit that state to one aggregate state that is a single source of truth. And I think this is really the problem or the struggle that leadership has today, right? There is, in a moderately sized company, in the speed of operation of today, there is no single objective truth about the state of that organization. So in pushing this kind of ever more marginal gain towards certainty, there's just so many opportunities to stop at understanding, right? Understanding is good enough if you can make a decision and move forward. But people to say, oh well, okay, I understand a little bit more now, but I want to be certain, and they forget all that their understanding and they try and go for certainty because they think that there is some objective truth that they can get to, and that for me is like the big problem at the moment.
So I know Chris has to go. So last word from you, Chris, and then we'll end it. I'll end the recording, and then everybody else will see it when it gets online. Chris, final thoughts.
No, I think that we've explored some, I think we've looked back at some ground we've already covered with some new understanding, which is always, good. Spaced learning is a thing, right? So the more you kind of go over things over time, the kind of deeper it sinks down and the better understanding you get. And I think that we're covering some really interesting concepts as to, how this is starting to fit into these really big complex systems like, industries and so on. And, and I think the last thing I was going to say, just from what Ben was saying, was in terms of certainty. We love certainty, we love comfort, but I think when you get to the point where you have absolute certainty, it's kind of like having absolute transparency. Like, you never do anything because you just you know, where's the joy in life? Where's the exploration? Where would the innovation be? We'd never progress again. We'd just make basic decisions because certainty would be there. So I think there's a balance point, and that's the nice thing about being human, is the fact that we do tend to, you know, pendulum all over the place. But it's not black and white. That's my last thing. It's not black and white.
So I appreciate that, Chris, and I think that was a nice way to wrap up. And I appreciate our colleagues in Australia crawling out of bed at the crack of dawn. Although it sounded like Andrew was up since about 3 a.m. with sort of the night before problems. But and so let me stop the recording. Let me stop the recording before we go too far. 1 second.